Okay, welcome to our class live Zoom session, everyone. Uh, well, everyone. No one's actually in the Zoom session right now. Maybe I'll get one or two people to join. It's still relatively early. Let me see if I can get this thing changed around a little bit. Okay. Let's see about the lighting. Okay, a little bit better. We have the recording going here. I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing some participants come in. Let me see here. I'm excited to be teaching this class, general psychology. Psychology is one of my favorite things. I have degrees in psychology, and you probably read, or maybe you didn't, read my bio and everything. But I just want to pull a few of my notes here, and I do hope we have some people join us. I'm in my office, so you can actually see my office right now. It's my wife's office mainly. I share it with her, and I just had a client. So Saturday evening, I just had a client leave, a wonderful gentleman. So I'm going to pull up some notes that I have here. I'll go through those. Hopefully, some folks will join us. If not, I'm just going to go through the notes, and I will miss you. It's nice to have some folks on here. If you're watching this on the recording, and if you see me and you hear me, then it is on the recording because I think I still am the only one in fact, I'm sure I'm the only participant in the class. But if you're able to join me, it makes for a much more exciting and interesting class live presentation because we can have some interactions. And if you're the only one or only a few people here, you kind of get a little bit of extra attention from your humble professor. So we're going to talk about what psychology is, the scientific study of the mind and behavior. It's sometimes called the study of mental processes and behavior. You know, that seems very simple and it's a short definition, but boy, oh boy, is it power packed with a lot of things because the mind, as you saw this week, we're talking about neurons and electrons and synapses and hormones and different things like that you're posting actually this week as you talk about your moods and how serotonin impacted your moods and how your moods impacted serotonin perhaps. So, and then behavior, what motivates us to behave in certain ways? And that gets a little bit into social psychology too, like in a group, what makes us speak out or what makes us want to be quiet or what makes us get upset and do things, getting upset is not a behavior, but doing something about it is. So it's a good working definition, but the more you know about psychology, the more you realize that simple definition packs a powerful punch. You know, one of the things that is interesting to me, we'll just say it's interesting to me in when I teach general psychology or any psychology course, but certainly general psychology, is students sometimes don't appreciate that it is a science. It's a social science, which is a science. A lot of times, students will want to share their opinions about which they should. I encourage opinions, But there are times when students think that because they know of one incident that is contrary to what a particular psychological study is presenting, let's just say that it is people tend to be friendly with other people from their socioeconomic status. And students will bring up an example of a friend they have that is either more wealthy than they are or less wealthy and significantly, and they'll say, well, that's not true. Well, that, in other words, that psychological study is not true. Well, giving one example that is not in line with a study that included maybe 500 or 1,000 or maybe 10,000 people doesn't negate the study, doesn't negate the science. One of the things that is a challenge for the social sciences, any social science, um, could be economics even for that matter, or sociology and psychology. One of the challenges is it's not and can never be done in a lab, in a laboratory, where um, the so-called hard sciences, biology, chemistry, let's say chemistry, they can be done in a much more controlled environment. Let's say that you're in a chemistry lab and you take 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, you put those together, you're always going to get water, H2O water. 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, that's going to give you water. However, it's never, unless it's pure hydrogen and pure oxygen, then it'll be pure water, but oftentimes it's not. The water that we get out of the water fountain, people can simply, oh, yeah, it's obviously 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. But if you put it under a microscope, you'll find out that there are other things there also. So in the social sciences, psychology, for example, we can't control it. In the laboratory, you can sterilize all the tubes and make and run the everything through filters. Let's say once you have the water there, you run it through filters. You can look at this is definitely 100% pure water, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. In social sciences, you can't do that. You can't sterilize people. There are going to be, you might get 2 people very similar to each other, 2 45-year-old white males from Florida, but there are so many other variables that they're going to not have. So you will put them through maybe a study or look at what they would do in certain situations and find out. Sometimes you can predict it depending on the different variables that you put in an experiment. But you can't always predict it for every 45-year-old white male from Florida because everyone has a different history. Everyone has different experiences, education, family of origin could be different. So that does not mean, I go through all of that to say that does not mean that psychology is not a science, because it most definitely is a science. We look at what some people call the hard sciences, or math, and it's biology, chemistry, physics, things like that. And again, they're not pure. I like to look at psychology and the social sciences, not necessarily as the soft sciences, but the essential sciences. Of course, this is my opinion. I am passionate about psychology. I hope you understand from where I come. You may not share the passion of psychology. You may be more interested in biology or chemistry or economics, management, which all borrows from psychology. Certainly, management does. But that's where I stand on it. And as you study psychology, even though this is probably the first course or one of the first college courses you've taken, is this is general psychology. Understand that people who are passionate about this do consider it a science. So I won't belabor that anymore. I always talk about this. This isn't even necessarily part of my notes, but I always discuss and mention when I'm teaching psychology, the long arm of psychology. The long arm of psychology. I say that because this week we're looking at biological basis of behavior. In essence, you're asked to write down your moods and your feelings and things like that, and your behaviors, and then kind of look at what chemicals are operating and hormones are operating in your brain, serotonin and epinephrine and norepinephrine and things like that. So that's psychology. But also psychology is social psychology, where we look at how people behave within groups, individual behavior within groups. Similar to that is personality theory, looking at people's personalities and how once you kind of know someone's personality type, you can oftentimes predict their behavior, or you can predict sometimes even their feelings and their thoughts. There are people who are sort of more hardwired, if you will, to be quiet, introverts. It doesn't mean they're shy. It doesn't mean, and we're going to learn more about this as I don't want to get ahead of myself, but being an introvert doesn't mean you're shy. It doesn't mean you don't have social skills. On the contrary, it just means that you kind of get your energy from within, if you will, for lack of a better term. That's not the best term, probably. But as opposed to being an extrovert, you get your energy from people, from being around people, from conversing with people, from actually making that real tangible connection, shaking hands and finding out more about them. Where an introvert kind of sits and contemplates, and it's not that they don't think about people, they consider people and they esteem them. They just don't do it outwardly like the extroverts do. So that's psychology. School psychology is another psychology, and that really falls under teaching psychology. Educational psychology. I take that back. Educational psychology really has to do with teaching psychology, especially at the post-secondary level, whereas school psychology lends itself more to like a clinical psychology, where we're doing testing to see maybe why children aren't learning, or adults for that matter, aren't learning as we think they should. Then there's family psychology, and there's sports psychology, what looks at motivation and performance and things such as that. So the psychology, there's a long arm of psychology. I'm reading your introductions in the tab, how some of you say you want to learn about this, you want to learn about that. I'm impressed by that, and I'm motivated by that. But the fact of the matter is, this is what we call a survey course. We're going to touch on those things, and you're going to get you're going to sort of whet your appetite. But by no means did you put the pressure on yourself to think that you're going to come out of this course at the end of a Psych 101 course, a general psychology course, knowing everything there is to know about sleep disorders or addiction, drug addiction, or sleep patterns. All those things pertain to psychology, and you're going to spend more time reading and investigating and maybe looking at YouTube videos on those things you're interested in. But by no means could we all be an expert after any course, any Psychology 101 course with the things that are interesting to you. My passion, my goal for any general psychology course, or what we sometimes call a Psych 101 course, is that you do find that subfield, if you will, of psychology to pursue. It may be clinical psychology, it may be school psychology, it may be sports psychology. There's also, oh goodness gracious, there's 44 different divisions in the American Psychological Association organization. Family psychology, I may mention family psychology. Addiction psychology, oh goodness, the psychology of leadership, industrial and organizational psychology, social psychology, and personality. So if you have questions about any of those, if you have a passion for those, that's what I'm here for. By all means, the best way to contact me, and I'll mention this again and again and again, with any questions, or certainly with anything to do with the course. But if you have questions or concerns, or just an interest in one of the subfields I mentioned, the best way to get me is through the message tab right here in the course room. You have my other contact information. You have my phone number there, which is my cell phone, so you can call or you can text. You also have my email address. You can send an email, and of course the message tab. And you're welcome to use any of those. But let me just take a minute here and take a little bit of an aside. Point out, I check the message tab or the ask questions tab, certainly the message tab, at least every day, usually several times a day. I do it like in my, like I make sure I do it in the morning, and pretty much I make sure I do it at night. And then when I have some off time when I'm on the computer, I just log in and just go and see if there's any messages there, and try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. So when I say, at least once a day, you can almost guarantee twice a day. And pardon me, depending on how many sort of breaks I get in between, I'll go on because I'm, checking on that all the time. I am in classes other times. Like earlier tonight, I was with a client, so I don't answer emails or texts or phone calls during those times, just like I wouldn't answer a phone call if I was talking to you, or I'm not going to answer a phone call in this class live. So so when I check, and I get back pretty quick. So that's probably the best way. I won't belabor that any further. We'll talk a little about testing and how to gather data and things like that. That's in the book, and I think it's mentioned in the presentations. Again, that's just the survey part of it. I will mention that the father of psychology, so-called, many people consider him the father of psychology, is Wilhelm Wundt, or what I call him Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German psychologist. Not typically what people think of when they first think of psychologist. He had a lab in the 1800s, and he was measuring reaction time of people. Pretty ingenious stuff, and he's listed in your book. And he's measuring how quickly people react in two different scenarios there. So, kind of basic research. It's still pretty cool. You may not think much of it now, considering the tools that we have, but for the time, very interesting, and way ahead of his time there, way ahead of the game. Naturally, most people think the first, when they think of the early psychologists, they think of Sigmund Freud, and rightly so. He's the first psychoanalyst, the first talk therapy doctor, a fascinating character. Many people think he's a kook. In fact, a whole lot of people, probably most people, don't give him a lot of credit these days, and thought he has some pretty outlandish ideas. But let me just say that well, yeah, some of those were pretty outlandish. We're still using some of those today. People in different schools of thought for therapy still like to hear about their clients' dreams. We're still using hypnosis, which is not something he invented, but he or developed, I guess is a better word, but it is something that he used and made more popular. The relationships with parents, he had his ideas, and there's some validity. I won't get into it now in terms of why he felt that way and how that would make sense. Nonetheless, we often now in therapy talk about how was your relationship with your parents. I think I mentioned dreams, and we still talk about transference. He was the first one to talk about transference, which is where you project your feelings of either anger or love that you have with someone else. You project those feelings onto your therapist. From Freud, we get into Adler and Carl Jung, and then through the therapies. And again, counseling psychology is only one part, or one leg, or one arm of this broad field of psychology. Tremendously broad field. It's immense. So we used to have this debate whether people did things, thinking of motivation and behavior, if people did things because of nature or nurture. Were people born that way, or is it society that influenced their behavior? And even when I was starting to study psychology, it seemed like you had one side, you had the other side. Pretty much now, it's accepted by anyone worth their weight that it is neither all nature nor all nurture. It is a combination and an intertwining. And it's not easy to define how much is nature versus how much is nurture, or even how much is nature in certain situations and how much is nurture in other situations, or the relationship and how they can be influenced. So it comes down to free will versus determination. Determination would be that it's nature. I was born, this is the way I am, I can't change. I'm angry, I'm bitter, that's just, it's not my fault, it's my parents who made me this way. As opposed to free will, like I can choose to be happy, I can choose to be sad, I can choose to make a difference in the world, I can choose my behaviors, as opposed to, well, I'm a criminal because I was born into a family of criminals and I can't change. I shouldn't even try. So, yeah, certainly your history and the family you're born into does influence you in terms of part of that's behavior, but also in terms of the genes and DNA you inherited from your mom and dad and your grandparents. But it is not, no one worth their weight at all believes that it is 100% decided. Your behavior is 100% decided by your DNA. No one ever believes. No one these days believes that. Let me take a step back here. And I'm happy at Central Christian College because most college general psychology classes will have you believe that I taught the first psychologist I mentioned, Wilhelm Wundt, pardon me, W-N-D-T, W-U-N-D-T, Wundt. But we do make reference, at least in this course, of the early philosophers, which some people consider them early psychologists. The Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates even, and European Renaissance philosophers, and Descartes, Hobbes, I can't think of the other one that slips my mind. It'll come to me. Pascal, who's a Christian preacher. Some consider him to be an early psychologist as well, because early on, before there was actual sort of therapy, people got their psychological help from, excuse me, from the pulpit. Pardon me. So we do make some allowance for that in this course, and you'll see in your handouts or your PowerPoint there, we made sort of a transition from philosophy to psychology, and that again gets back into is psychology a science? Because this next wave of psychologists that came along after Freud, who I mentioned before, said, psychology is a science, and you can't measure this unconscious, you can't even see it. And so Freud, we're going to get away from that. So that's when the behaviorists came along, people like Skinner, and Pavlov was a behaviorist, where they said, if we can train you and we can see how many times it takes you or an animal to learn to ring the bell to get food, and how, so that's something I can see and I can measure. Like Pavlov's dogs, he brought them in. You may be familiar with the experiment, and he would ring a bell and then he would feed them. And after a period of time doing this, he would ring the bell and they would salivate at the bell, not at the food. So he conditioned them. So that's something that psychologists kind of went to and said, okay, this is something that we can see and we can measure. If I reward people for doing a behavior that I want, say for instance workers, if I give them, or let's say kids, if I give them a piece of chocolate every time they do a homework problem, and that is sort of shaping their behavior, so I can make them do the homework by giving them chocolate, or maybe even just saying something nice. But the idea is I can um, do a behavior in order to influence your behavior, and that can be done, but it doesn't operate in isolation. So that's we can get into that, and we probably will. I think in a week or two. I think it's maybe this week coming up. We're going to get into some discussions about that. So I don't want to tip my hat too early on that. Um, Wilhelm Wundt is mentioned in our notes here as well. So just, real quick, kind of trying with my notes. I'm passionate about psychology. I think psychology can really help people in a lot of ways. I am a Christian person, and I'm blessed. I heard a great sermon today. I go to church on Saturday. I heard a great sermon today. And psychology can be, and in my life, is very much in line with Scripture. We know how human beings learn. From an educational standpoint, people learn very well from listening to stories. Jesus used stories to teach people. We know very well that people need relationships. There's a psychological need that we must have relationships. When people are taken prisoner in war, even in our country, when they're put in prison, to try and punish them or to try and actually break them, there are two things that the prisoners, the guards would do. Let's say to someone who's been taken prisoner of war. One is sleep deprivation. Our mind needs sleep. We need rest. The Bible tells us that we need rest. The other is to put them in isolation or solitary confinement. That, people think they're strong, but after, a very short period of time, people start to have big distress. Some can hold out longer than others, but it's not long being in isolation or being in solitary confinement that people will start to have hallucinations. They'll start to be depressed. They'll start to have all kinds of anxiety. The Bible says, and I believe for all eternity, that we were created to have relationships. If you look at Genesis, it's very clear. God made Adam and Eve. The fact of who God is three persons in one. It's not, and this is my belief, based on my understanding of the Bible. You don't have to necessarily adhere to this religious belief. But I'm a big believer in what we call the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I believe they are three distinct beings that are one God. Hard to understand, much less explain, so I'm not going to get into a talk about the Trinity. But other than that, we're built for relationships. And so everything with psychology that I do is very much in line with my religious beliefs. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and end the class live. I would hopefully will see some of you next week. Join me so we can have a conversation. If you can, I understand. Don't worry about it. But usually I give a Bible verse to, for those who watch the recording who want to get their extra credit points. What I'm going to do this time, I'm not going to give you a Bible verse, but I am going to say to you, I told you earlier the best way to contact me, probably the most effective and most efficient way, is through the message tab in the course room. Oftentimes, I can't get to my text. A lot of times it's the texts are too long, what have you. So if I'm on in the course room, I can actually go in and actually help, because sometimes you ask a question about an assignment. I need to go back and look at the assignment to make sure I give you the right information. So it's easier for you and more efficient, because if I get the text, you've written the text, I read it, but I can't answer it. usually until I go in the course room. So I said, use the message tab. The problem with email is when I get an email, students typically have on their email a name, not I said typically, but oftentimes have a name on their email that's not the name that I know you as in the course room. You know, Tommy Smith is, I don't think there's a Tommy Smith in this class, just as an example. Tommy Smith is best mechanic in Dayton, Ohio.com or whatever at gmail.com. Sally Jones is a woman of God, 11, which is absolutely fine. But I don't necessarily recognize those, and they tend to get pushed down, down, down. So anyway, you can do it, but the most efficient way is through the message tab. So that's how you'll earn your points. So you watch this recording, and you tell me in the message tab. That's the key to earning your points, to let me know that you watched this video or recording, I should say. It's not a video, recording, and got my little overview of psychology. So that's what you'll tell me. Best way to contact Dr. Nicholas is in the message tab in this course room. So that being said, on a Saturday evening, I hope that you are all having a wonderful weekend. I'm going to stop the recording and end the meeting, and I will I'll be in the course room tomorrow, finishing up and interacting with you, and maybe even grading some of your applied papers if you've turned them in. I try and get a head start on that on Sunday so that I don't get taken away in a week. Anyway, God bless each and every one of you, and I will be talking to you soon. Good night.